Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal. So far, I believe we're about a fourth or even a fifth week into Season 2 content of The War Within, and so far Season 2 has been a banger season, especially for content like Mythic Plus Dungeons, with so many changes done for M+, from new rewards to get more players to push into 3k score and above, a way for players to secure that their keys no longer degrade past a certain level once you hit a brand new floor, starting from +12s and going up, allowing players to push up their dungeons better than ever. The changes to Mythic Plus dungeon gear as well as crests, with +6s and 7s being more rewarding, as well as the adjustment of the affixes, have allowed more players to engage with the system, especially at the high end, and it becomes one of the better ways to gear up a character. It overall has created a better environment that's a little bit less toxic, since you no longer have that one affix that punishes every single death. Doesn't mean that every dungeon is going to be easy, and not for all classes, with some classes performing really well but others kind of struggling. And normally we like to highlight some of the best out there on the channel, but I actually wanted to take a time to highlight the classes that are not doing nearly as well as potentially could be for Season 2. With a couple of tweaks, Blizz could definitely bring these classes a little bit more into meta, but I want to highlight the classes that are right now not having the easiest time when it comes to the overall representation regarding Mythic Plus dungeons within Season 2 so far, as well as offer some of the suggestions as to how they could fix them. As always, if you guys want to see more regular updates for War Within expansion, be sure to follow the channel and subscribe, but otherwise, let's dive right in. The first one on the list will be one of my favorites, and that's actually a fan favorite, the Fury Warrior. A super fun melee that's fairly easy for most players to get into and to even give them a proper go. It is that archetype berserker playstyle that's just quite amazing. It draws in so many players, and I think it hits just right in terms of its fast-paced gameplay, its mobility, and the aggression at which you just build that rage and then deliver it with back-to-back rampages. However, we have seen the spec falling behind in M+ a little bit. Not quite that bad where they're becoming less popular for like your weekly +10 keys or anything, but their push potential has gotten lower this season. There's a couple of different things that may cause it, but to give you an idea, they're slightly less popular than a Feral Druid when it comes to pushing dungeons. Feral Druids historically are not great for Mythic Plus, or not a popular pick in general, usually outshined by other melee or bumpkins, but even this season is allowing ferals to flourish, which is great for them, but it just tells you kind of how dire of a situation it may be for Fury. And they can do well, they can push some high-end dungeons, there's a handful of Furies that are doing it, but their numbers just overall in some of the higher-end content, which more players are getting to engage with this season, which is really good to see, but that engagement for Fury is a lot lower compared to ARMS. A couple of things that may be causing this one. The dungeons are very AoE heavy, so having a target cap on any class is detrimental. And as somebody who plays Outlaw, which can only hit 8 targets maximum, nothing really beyond that, you definitely do feel it in dungeons like Cinderbrew or Priory, where big pulls are necessary to try to complete those dungeons as quickly as possible. Fury, on the other hand, without being capped to 8 targets, you have a 5 target cap thanks to improved Whirlwind. You do have a handful of abilities like Blaze Storm, maybe like your Odin Sphere that can do a bit of AoE damage, and if you play around with Mountain Thane, I guess, you also get a little bit more damage out with Thunderclap, which is technically reduced beyond 5 targets, so it's not completely hard capped, but you are kind of limited in terms of how many targets you can affect at once to some degree. Previously, Fury Warrior would have like a very bit of the burst gameplay with Reckless Abandon, and you could combine together bursty cooldowns, and you didn't really play around long-term CDs, but ever since they changed Reckless Abandon, you could either go with a 1.5 minute huge burst window and then not really a lot of damage outside of it, or go with the anger management, which is what a lot of Fury Warriors have switched back to this season, where you have good damage kind of constantly with some burst cooldowns here and there, but you don't really have like that huge burst that can combine together with some of those big buttons that can deal soft cap 5 target damage. And I think that soft cap definitely hurts the spec compared to ARMS. We could just press cleave and hit literally everything in front of it, which is in a lot better shape. Plus it has Blaze, which don't really have that same target scaling as well, so it has a little bit more overall output. Warriors in general are a class that also bring quite a bit of low utility within dungeons. I mean, things like Shockwave are really good, Spell Reflection can kind of be good at times, but I really think the class in general, maybe needs a little bit more. AoE Stones, AoE Fears are cool, but they're just not enough because other classes bring that same utility, so it becomes less unique. I don't know, something about their class really needs to change, because right now they're really valued for their damage, and Fury Warriors right now are at least a little bit behind Arms Warriors in terms of their profile, because if damage is the only thing you can really go by, then right now Arms Warriors has the ability to at least damage all targets in front of it and around it, where Fury Warriors' target cap is kind of holding it back a little. Now, another spec that's kind of forced to compete from the shadows is Survival Hunter, which is one of my favorite specs of Hunter. It is an incredibly fun playstyle that fuses together ranged damage, melee damage, with a great amount of mobility, allowing you to dip in and dip out of danger whenever you want to, and I absolutely adore this playstyle, personally. However, right now in Mythic Plus dungeons, at least even after some of the different buffs they've gotten, it is a little better, but their output overall is ranked by most players in the community as kind of mid, is the best way to describe it. They're not terrible, they're not completely garbage, but they're not insane either. They don't necessarily stand out, even if you try to optimize their talent tree, whether you play Sentinel, whether you play Pack Leader, where there's some viability of Pack Leader to potentially play around. A little bit of this cleave, focus down playstyle, more funnel-based damage, a higher priority in single target, without losing too much in AoE. Even with that being said, they're just not quite where they need to be. I generally like the rework they've gotten, and with the tiers that they have right now, there's definitely a lot of encouragement around big Mongoose Bite or Raptor Strike based gameplay, especially with some of the cleave that it offers, but it just hasn't quite been able to really break a lot of representation in some of the higher M+ dungeons, where beyond 14+, which is where players are really getting competitive, they kind of drop off like a rock, where other melee look fairly healthy and varied in comparison. Though it's not unusual for survival, they kind of have always been a black sheep of the Hunter spec, being the only melee spec of what primarily is known as a ranged playstyle. I think it just needs a little bit of a damage amp within AoE more than single target in order to bring him a little bit more up to speed within Mythic Plus, because technically they have a really good kit that should do well in massive, large AoE packs and pulls, since they're not really hard capped by most damage. So it's surprising to see that they're not really flourishing as well as they could be. But with that, that's going to be the only two DPS that really seem to be struggling a little bit compared to everybody else, which means that the actual meta for melee and ranged DPS classes looks surprisingly healthy, so which allows us to move on to another role like tanks. And Brewmaster Monk would have to make this list. Brewmaster didn't get a lot of changes heading into Season 2. When you have a class that doesn't really receive a lot of changes, there's always a potential that it might start to fall behind, because it means there's very little room for improvement of the spec outside of your tier set, or maybe potentially comp changes as some of the classes get rotated out of the meta, like we saw with Augmentation Evokers, for instance. So Brewmasters generally have a lot of factors that could potentially bring them up, and it seems to have somewhat affected their performance. Also, because they did a pretty big tank overhaul a while back to try to make healers more involved in tank survivability, all tanks got affected by it differently, and tanks do require a little bit more healing, but a lot of them found themselves to be quite sustainable. From Eldraki Demon Hunters with Vengeance, being able to basically heal yourself without necessarily needing a healer. Even Protection Warriors are fairly sturdy, not really taking a lot of damage too quickly. Prot Paladins got self-healing, Blood DKs got self-healing, Guardian Druids are fairly tanky. Brewmaster, however, is not quite self-reliable. Even though it's a class that's all about, weaving the mist to heal itself thematically, it doesn't quite do that as well as some of the other options, and in some ways Brewmaster needs to be babysat, quote-unquote, by a healer. Reliance on healers, especially in pug content, can be rough. Like, if you have a comp and you have a healer that knows exactly how Brewmaster works defensively, you can definitely play around with it, but when you're pugging, which is what a lot of players are doing, it does mean your day-to-day experiences are going to be a little bit rough if the healer isn't aware of exactly how to heal a Brewmaster effectively, which can definitely sour the experience. But either way, I salute to all Brewmasters that are still sticking with the spec. It hasn't been a smooth season for them so far in Season 2, but hopefully we'll see adjustments in the future patches to bring up their self-survivability even a little bit. I would like also a bit of a rework with the talents, just again to simplify some of that rotational bloat even a little bit, but even if they could just bring him a little bit more of that tankiness and self-sufficiency, I think that could definitely go a long way for this spec, because it has an awesome toolkit otherwise. From there, we got the healing specs, which are a little bit easier to explain as to why they're falling behind in the overall meta, and sometimes suggestions as to what would make them better. As somebody who doesn't really prioritize healer as a role, it is a little bit harder for me to come up with a way for them to potentially fix them. But I can definitely point out some of the issues that the specs have had, starting with Holy, which isn't a bad healing spec whatsoever. In fact, it's actually one of the easier healers to get into, especially for new players. It's adaptable to dangerous situations, especially when things just happen out of nowhere. It has great spot healing for the most part. It just doesn't quite fit the M+ environment right now. As of this moment, it did get buffed up recently, which does make him a little better. It does make him a little better for raids as well, but in Mythic Plus, it just doesn't quite hit exactly the same way as it could. Primarily because it doesn't shift their gameplay in any significant way for M+, at least as of this moment. And with the popularity of Disc still not really being shaken, you could always just switch over to the more meta spec in order to just simplify and solve a lot of the issues you're looking for when it comes to healing dungeons. But for Holy right now, if they weren't to fix it, it just seems like their output right now, at least compared to the competition, it's just not quite enough. They're not a bad healing spec by much. They don't really have too many more disadvantages compared to Disc, outside of maybe protections that absorbs and damage reductions, which can be very, very useful in some of the encounters, but their output just right now doesn't seem to be nearly as competitive as the alternatives. And the last class on the list will be Evoker, where we have a 2-for-1 feature with Preservation, which is one of my favorite healing playstyles because of the whole echo mechanic where you can just copy heals over. Yeah, it's not quite doing well in Mythic Plus. It has the lowest healer representation for the season, especially for some of the higher end dungeons, and I think primarily a good portion of it comes down to the reliance on group content and pre-made groups in order to succeed in Mythic Plus dungeons, as this is one of the harder healers to play, especially when it comes to random pug groups. The shorter range of many of your skills and heals just feels a little off this season compared to the last season, where I felt like Season 1 dungeons were structured in a way where you could get group members a little bit together, or rather in front of you a little bit more easily. This time around, especially in pugs, it feels like everybody is going all over the place, and even the tier set that they get to play with, which is a little bit better for burst healing and being able to off-heal spread groups a little better, it's just not quite doing it. For Preservation, you really need positionals. Everybody needs to position in correct spots for you to be able to effectively heal them as best as possible. And on random pugs, when players are all over the place and can get out of range or miss a line just in a different spot, miss some of your frontal heals, it definitely becomes a little bit harder. Then we need to do a bit of an adjustment in terms of the challenge to allow for a more non-positional based healing to shine for Mythic Plus, for them to start being a little bit more successful. But as of right now, they definitely are not really pug friendly, which I think hurts them in the overall meta. And the last spec will be Augmentation, mostly because it is the sacrificial lamb on the altar of Mythic Plus Season 2. Changed and nerfed to such a degree on purpose, just so that other classes can be played. With them nerfing Aug by as much as they did within Mythic Plus and within raids, we actually are seeing a lot of variety within classes at the high-end Mythic Plus dungeons. There's still quite a lot of flexibility, quite a lot of classes are doable, and with Augmentation no longer taking that mandatory spot, there's quite a lot of opportunity for other playstyles to shine. However, where for the other specs I had suggestions as to how they could go about fixing it and solving some of the issues to make the specs a little bit better, I don't think they're planning on buffing up Augmentation anytime soon. The changes that Aug saw during the PTR for Season 2 were specifically to take him out of the meta. Everything that was done to reduce some of their viability within 5-man content and raiding content and tone down their group capability over like the buff support stuff, it's all been done on purpose to remove them from the meta completely. I don't think, and I'm not going to be convinced anytime soon, that we're trying to find a way to like bring him more in line with other classes, but then they just fell off and it's just something I think they heard a lot of the community say that, hey, Aug's been top tier for multiple seasons now, can we maybe allow other classes to play? And as soon as you take out Aug, there's a lot of variety in terms of what classes are now competitive. I don't think they're going to be adjusting this one anytime soon. If anything, I am personally convinced that they are more likely to rework this spec completely, and are more likely to increase its own damage contribution while minimizing a lot of the buff-based gameplay. It's hard to tell exactly what Blizzard will do, but I feel like at this point, unless you end up completely gutting Augmentation, if it's ever even a little viable for a season, it just brings way too many unique things to a 5-man party, making it a cornerstone choice and a cornerstone of just about every group. So it's either insanely good or it's incredibly bad. There's no two ways about it. You can't really find a middle ground for it, so I could totally see a rework at some point in the future. But with that, as always, I do want to thank all of you guys so much for watching and hope you guys did enjoy the video. If you did enjoy it or found it informative, go ahead and give it a like. I would very much appreciate it. Join our Discord community, probably the best place to discuss all of the new class changes that appear when it comes to Season 2 meta as soon as we get any new patch notes, which we'll be getting more and more of them as of recently. Also, let me know all your thoughts in the comments down below, and as always, I'll see all of you guys in our next one.